Well, here I am. It's Serpkerp again, here to talk about the traditional Catholic iceberg. Well, obviously I finished my original iceberg, but the thing is that I forgot stuff, so I have to make an addendum iceberg. And I don't know if this will actually be the last addendum iceberg video I make. I kind of expect to make these over time because I guess there's just more. There's always going to be more to learn about this topic, more history, and things that happen that I won't be aware of until years later. And the other thing is, I'm not a Sedevacantist anymore, right? So my Sedevacantist period, that would have been at the very beginning of Francis's papacy. So I'm not active in those circles, so when things happen in those circles, I only know about it years later. And so I expect to make kind of an addendum video, probably not as frequently as this one's coming after the original series of videos, but probably every few years or every year, something like that, because there's just so much to it, and there's so many different groups and so much stuff that's going on. You can only expect the iceberg to get deeper and deeper over time. So without further ado, let's get on this. The first one I have is Novus Ordo. That's something of a slur that a lot of Sedevacantists or the more radical traditionalists will use against mainstream Catholics. Of course, the Novus Ordo Mass, and "ite" makes it sound like some kind of heretical or non-Christian group. Next up, we have Tom Woods. Tom Woods wrote several books relating to Catholicism, most important to traditional Catholicism being the Great Facade, Vatican II, and the Regime of Novelty in the Catholic Church. He also wrote How the Catholic Church Built Western Civilization, which is kind of like a 101 introduction book to Catholic apologetics from the perspective of history. He's much more well known for advocating for libertarianism. Just kind of an interesting guy. He's a Rothbardian and anarcho-capitalist, that kind of radical libertarianism. And so he's interesting in that he also holds to these views, which many would think would be anti-Catholic, but is also a traditional Catholic. Next up, we have the Institute of the Good Shepherd. The Institute of the Good Shepherd is a traditionalist Catholic society in full communion with the Holy See. It actually is a split off from the Society of St. Pius X, which went into full regularization with the Holy See, you could say. I don't really want to say communion, because that would mean that the Society of St. Pius X would be a separate church body, like an Eastern Orthodox Church. I think regularization is a better term for it. It was founded by, I'm going to mispronounce this as everybody knows, Father Paul Iglier, who was the provincial superior for the Society of St. Pius X in France for a long period of time, from 76 to 94. And he kind of thought that what happened in Campos was the right idea, and that's what led to the Institute of the Good Shepherd. Mostly centered in France, as far as I can tell. It's a moderate-sized traditional Catholic group with 61 priests. Next up, we have Medieval World Appreciation. Medieval World Appreciation is Catholics that idealize the medieval world as the ideal political system. Obviously, there's been a lot of technological changes that have occurred since medieval times. So the standard of living is, of course, higher now in a lot of aspects of our lives with things like cars or vaccinations. But Catholics tend to view the medieval world, at least traditional Catholics do, in a very positive light, because that was probably the most that the church had in terms of influence over the morals and views of the regular people in society. Of course, in the Enlightenment and with liberal and then communist ideologies, the medieval world was deeply hated. Protestants, to a certain extent, at least later Protestants, would hate the medieval world as well. But a lot of what they do is, of course, has nothing to do with the real history that existed in the medieval world. There's often this idea that the Dark Ages, the period after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, is the same thing as the medieval world when they're two separate things. And in many ways, the medieval world was much more stable than the Roman world. Sure, the most of the Western Mediterranean wasn't unified under one empire, but the High Middle Ages, and even to a certain extent the Late Middle Ages, were a pretty stable world order. And it had a pretty sophisticated and intelligent philosophy and political philosophy going on. And so a lot of these criticisms from Protestants, liberals, and communists, and I guess the modern world in general, of the medieval world is built on false assumptions and terrible history that's merely just propaganda made up by people like Voltaire. Just garbage. And I don't know if the idealization is the best way. I think just, for the most part, a lot of serious Catholics will just straight up defend the medieval world, but won't idealize it, while more radical or traditional Catholics will idealize it. Next up, we have AA 1025, the Memoirs of an Anti-Apostle. This is a strange kind of traditional Catholic propaganda book, which purports to be an expose of the communist takeover of the Catholic Church and undermining of the Catholic Church within. So it's supposedly found by the nun Marie Carre in France, and it's been translated into several languages. This is kind of one of the most important books when it comes to the whole infiltration of the Catholic Church, led to the Vatican II and the decline of the Catholic Church in the 20th century, 21st century kind of genre of conspiracies. This is a very important book in that genre. When it comes to these conspiracy theory typed memoirs or manifestos that are supposed to be made by the enemy of the people that discovers them, things like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, or, the Majestic 12, I don't know. I don't put that much weight into that kind of thing. And this sounds mean because I'm comparing, the Catholic Church, or I guess an offshoot of Catholicism, to the Protocols. But I'm also comparing it to the Majestic 12 document. And so I just kind of see it as the same thing. It's just kind of like this thing that's supposedly written by your opposition, where you put everything you want them to say to make them into your opposition into the document and purport that they wrote it. Or say that they wrote it and it's anonymous and I just found it. It's a pretty popular genre or type of document in conspiracy fiction. Or rather, should I say, conspiracy faction. Next we have the Great Monarch. The Great Monarch is a motif within Catholic prophecies of the future or of the end times, where there arises a great monarch who reestablishes, you could say, the medieval world order, but in the modern world. Now, as we're getting further and further on, of course the motif goes back probably to the apocalypse of pseudo-Methodists, but maybe further back. There's kind of like little offshoots of this idea in a lot of different countries. So there's the idea of a resurrected King Arthur legend that connects to it, and similar legends or similar ideas. It's pretty popular in France after Napoleon III was overthrown, for those advocating a return to the monarchy. And so the whole basis of it is that during the end times, or just prior to the end times, there would be a great Catholic monarch who would unify all of Europe, or at least unify one of the great countries of Europe, and do battle with the enemies of the Church. Of course, then eventually, if this is set in the end times, usually somehow there's some kind of second apostasy after everything the Great Monarch does falls apart. Sometimes the Great Monarch is in alliance with an angelic pope who also reforms the church and leads to vast conversions, sometimes including most Jews and all of the Muslim religion. And there are prophets, prophetic teachings of mystics that talk about it. I don't know how valuable they are. A lot of them are kind of like venerables, sometimes blesseds. It's all private revelation, though. I don't really see the idea of the Great Monarch in Scripture as much. I guess sometimes people connect the Book of Daniel and to a certain extent the Book of Revelation to it, but I don't really see it in either the Book of Daniel or Revelation. Of course, both of those texts are extremely difficult to decipher. It's definitely a fun thing, but take it with a grain of salt, if you will. Next up, we have the Knox Bible. The Knox Bible is an English translation of the Vulgate, which was written by the priest Ronald Knox, or translated by the priest Ronald Knox. Of course, it's not going to be the most accurate Bible translation, but a lot of traditional Catholics really like it. And I'm saying it's not going to be the most accurate Bible translation because, it's not using the original sources, and it's not using the Vulgate in that original way, and in fact it's not as loyal to the Vulgate as the Douay-Rheims. And the other thing is, I think a lot of people forget, is that yes, the Douay-Rheims used the Vulgate as its primary source that it directly translated, but as they did that, the scholars were aware of the Greek and looked upon it. With the Knox Bible, it's the work of one man, and it's a lot less one-to-one in its translation. It's a lot more poetic on purpose, knowing that it won't be used for study, it will be used for being pretty. And in that, it is very pretty. I do recommend reading it. It is a very good read. Next up, we have tradversion. This is a word that Trillian made up, I think, and that's where you have somebody that's raised kind of nominal Catholic, and their experience to become a serious Catholic is so overwhelming that it's like a conversion experience, and so therefore a tradversion. Next up, we have Chris Fiera, or Christopher Fiera. He is a prominent Catholic lawyer and anti-abortion activist. He often represents advocates for the pro-life cause. He also talks about political concepts from a paleo-conservative lens, and he's a supporter of the late Father Nicholas Gruner, and the idea that the consecration of Russia to the Immaculate Heart was never formally conducted. He often appears and is a regular columnist in The Remnant. He's close. He's a close friend of the Matt family. And it's kind of interesting because I had Thomas Woods here. He wrote a book with Thomas Woods, which is a popular traditional Catholic book, The Great Facade, Vatican II, and the Regime of Novelty in the Catholic Church. And then later he would write Liberty, the God That Failed, Policing the Sacred and Constructing the Myths of the Secular State from Locke to Obama. And that kind of, that along with another book, The Church of the Libertarian, a defense of the Church's teaching on man, economy, and the state. These two books are critical of libertarianism, and it's kind of interesting since Thomas Woods was a collaborator with Fiera that Fiera would harshly criticize libertarianism as well. The Rhine flows into the Tiber. This is a popular book in traditional Catholic circles. It was written by Father Ralph Wiltgen, and it talks about the Second Vatican Council from the point of view of somebody that was there. It kind of talks about how German theologians and French and Low Country theologians in the Netherlands and Belgium were more liberal, and how they pushed their agenda against the Spanish-speaking, Portuguese-speaking, English, and Italian-speaking Catholics, which were more conservative or traditionalist, and the battle between them and the Vatican. And it also, the River Rhine associated with Germany, and because Germany is associated with Protestantism, flows into the Tiber, so it kind of connects to the whole Protestant Reformation in its title. I've never read it myself, but it's a pretty popular primary source for traditional Catholics. Next up, we have Bishop Chum Swami. So Bishop Chum Swami, he was a Thai bishop, he's now deceased, who spoke very positively of the Society of St. Pius X after he left office, or has left his diocese. Next up, we have the Ratzinger Report. The Ratzinger Report, of course, was the 1985 book, which is basically just a series of interviews with Cardinal Ratzinger, who would become Benedict XVI, and he talks about the hermeneutic of rupture, his idea of the hermeneutic of continuity, his criticism of how the spirit of Vatican II has gone too far, and how the Catholic Church is being undermined, and the decline of the Catholic Church, and so on. And so this was a very popular book within a lot of traditional-minded, maybe, Catholic circles, or I guess theologically orthodox Catholics in the 1980s. Of course, Benedict XVI would later become Pope. Next up, we have More Catholic Than the Pope, an inside look at extreme traditionalism. This was a book written by Patrick Madrid and Pete Fury. It talks about the Society of St. Pius X and other traditionalist groups. It's kind of seen as a hit piece against traditional Catholicism, and a lot of people that have read it, I unfortunately have not read it yet, say that it is not aged well since the pontificates of Benedict XVI, Summorum Pontificum, the rise of millennials and Zoomers being interested in the Latin Mass, and the Francis papacy. Next up, we have Bishop Salvador Lazo. Salvador Lazo, he was a bishop in the Philippines in the 80s to the early 90s, and after he retired and left his diocese, he would become associated with the Society of St. Pius X. He never really actively helped in the ordinations of priests in the Society of St. Pius X, as far as I know, so a lot of people that are Sedevacantist, or I guess maybe even more radical members of the Society of St. Pius X, will use that to kind of talk about the question of validity associated with the new ordinations and the new consecrations that have come out since Vatican II. But it's just kind of interesting because Lazo, and to a lesser extent Bishop Chumani, in that it kind of shows that the Society of St. Pius X is not as schismatic and separate as a lot of anti-Society of St. Pius X people try to make them out to be. Okay, next up we have Novus Ordo canonizations are invalid. This is something that came up in the Francis papacy when John Paul II, John the 23rd, and Paul VI were all canonized as saints, and a lot of traditional Catholics did not like the fact that these popes, which were in opposition to what they hold dear, and who in the case of Paul VI, of course, revoked the Latin Mass and did a lot of damage, you could say, at Vatican II, that they became saints. And so a lot of Society of St. Pius X people, or more radical traditionalists, who still held that Francis was the Pope, they started to say that the modern way that Francis is canonizing saints is invalid. Next up, we have Dr. David Allen White. Dr. David Allen White is a close friend of Bishop Williamson. He would take a lot of Bishop Williamson's mailing list letters and make compilations of them. He taught at the Naval Academy, I believe, as a professor of English. He's a Shakespeare scholar, and he's written 3 biographies about traditional Catholic prelates. A biography about Archbishop Lefebvre, not seen as the definitive one. That one is the one by Bishop Tissier, but his is seen as a rather good one. His is The Horn of the Unicorn. He wrote the biography about Bishop Antonio de Castro Mayer in Brazil, Campos, of course, and now he's written a biography about his close friend, Bishop Williamson. He wrote a lot of stuff for the Society of St. Pius X, but siding with Bishop Williamson meant that now he's associated with the resistance movement. or the Society of St. Pius X resistance movement. Next up, we have Bishop Vitus Hübner. Bishop Vitus Hübner was a Swiss bishop who, after he retired in 2019, lived with the Society of St. Pius X, and he has recently passed away. He said that the revitalization of the Latin Mass is the only means for the restoration of the Catholic Church. So now we've had 3 mainstream prelates who had their own dioceses, who have been sympathetic or outright joined the Society of St. Pius X, which I feel really illustrates that the Society of St. Pius X is not a schismatic religion. Christina Gallagher. Christina Gallagher is an Irish laywoman who purports to have visions of Christ and the Virgin Mary, and there's claims of miraculous healings at her Lady of Peace, Our Lady Queen of Peace House of Prayer in Ireland. Pretty controversial, never officially condemned by the Church, and related to traditional Catholicism in a lot of the messages. What We Have Lost. This is a documentary which is rather old now. You can find it on YouTube, which is kind of gives out the traditional Catholic message. It's more Society of St. Pius X, or that kind of traditional or independent Catholic that believes that the papacy is still the true papacy, as opposed to Sedevacantist oriented. And it talks about the destruction of churches predominantly, and how their remodeling was destroyed, and the decline of the Latin Mass and the rise of the Novus Ordo. It's meant to be passed out to faithful Novus Ordo Catholics from traditionalists to try and help them come to the Latin Mass. The Daughters of Mary, Mother of Our Savior. This is the Society of St. Pius V nuns. It's interesting that there are far more Society of St. Pius V nuns, or the Daughters of Mary nuns, than there are priests in the society, or the congregation now of the Society of St. Pius V. It's just interesting that there's so many more nuns than there are priests. Of course, Father Shikata and Bishop Daniel Dolan have some pretty not nice things to say about the Daughters of Mary, Mother of Our Savior. I haven't really ever interacted with them, so I wouldn't have anything to say. But they seem to be a pretty successful congregation, or Sedevacantist congregation of nuns, with over 100 members. Diamondite. Diamondite refers to anyone who follows the Diamond Brothers, like Novus Ordite. It's meant to call them a non-Christian religion, heretical or cultish group. Of course, there are people that follow the Diamond Brothers, but they are mostly online. And the kind of slur from Sedevacantists usually is to call them Diamondites. Next up, we have Pius XII told Archbishop Took they could consecrate without papal approval. Apparently, Archbishop Took says he was told by Pius XII that he could consecrate bishops without papal approval, and that has to do with being a missionary bishop and the rise of the communists in the Civil War in Vietnam, and ultimately, of course, I guess it's just the Vietnam War. It's beyond a civil war, right? With the involvement of the United States and Australia and South Korea and so on. And so, because of that, a lot of Sedevacantists will say that he had the right to consecrate bishops however he saw fit, and that's very important because that can be used as an argument against home aloners. Because if Archbishop Took really had that ability, that means that he could consecrate bishops without papal approval. First of all, the whole excommunication that happened, you could say, if you believed that you weren't a Sedevacantist, right? That doesn't really matter, so it's a non sequitur. But with home aloner Sedevacantists, this is really important because they believe jurisdiction went extinct. But if Archbishop Took had the jurisdiction to consecrate all these bishops, that means that the entire home aloner thing is thrown out the window, and the vast majority, except for, the Society of St. Pius V or any Sedevacantist bishops that are going to descend probably from Bishop Williamson and Archbishop Lefebvre in the future, or from Eastern orders. But anyway, all the Took bishops the vast majority, before the tangent, of Sedevacantist bishops all have valid jurisdiction. And so the whole argument of homilonerism is cut off at the knees then. Archbishop Vigano is reconsecrated. Apparently, Archbishop Vigano announced that he had been reconsecrated, I believe, by Bishop Williamson, which is interesting and kind of points people into believing that Archbishop Vigano has become a more radical supporter of pretty radical traditionalism, possibly even Sedevacantism, according to Bishop Sanborn. Bishop Sanborn believes that he's a Sedeprivationist, apparently, at this point. Mario Dirksen is the guy behind Novus Ordo Watch, I believe, for the most part. At least the primary contributor, from my understanding. Novus Ordo Watch is very interesting because it's hard to know who's writing it if you go to the website. It seems rather anonymous, at least from a first glance. Next up, we have the next tier list, or the next segment of my thing. I split this into two segments because all these things that I left out before, some of these are rather normal or closer to the top, and a lot of these, though, are things that go below and are deeper, murkier, things that I missed out on the first time that people told me in a lot of these cases, or things that I forgot. So the second half, you could say, is the more schizo half. First up, we have William of Aachen was a Sede. William of Aachen was a Franciscan priest, theologian, and prominent scholastic. He would, of course, be the most influential and possibly founder of nominalism. I don't want to call him the founder of nominalism because that whole idea, the lack of universals to unify concepts in reality, in the higher reality of understanding and metaphysics, that obviously predates William of Ockham, not just in the West, in going back into Greek philosophy, but Buddhists, most Buddhists are nominalists. Nominalism is a universal recurring trend, even if not called such or even not formulated in the kind of way that Western metaphysics is formulated, is this reoccurring trend that obviously existed prior to Occam, but Occam brought it forth. Anyway, after that tangent, William of Ockham was a Franciscan during the whole John the 22nd crisis of the papacy, John the 22nd being one of the worst popes in history, at least to that point. He had a dispute with the Franciscan order and said that there's not a immediate judgment upon the death of a person, and this led William of Ockham to declare that John the 22nd was an anti-pope. So that makes William of Ockham the true Sedevacantist. I think the first Sedevacantist, from my understanding. There may be other Sedevacantists, at least prior to the Apostles of Infinite Love, but this is where, once you go back before the Apostles of Infinite Love, back before Vatican II, the whole Sedevacantism kind of fades out. But we can see now, and this is something I bumped into, really. Nobody else has really said this. This is something that I found out on my own, that William of Ockham was a Sedevacantist, but Sedevacantism predates Vatican II, which is fascinating. But William of Ockham was a Sedevacantist. He ended up getting excommunicated, and he became a renegade. He was renegades. He was in a small band of Franciscan dissidents or renegades who lived in exile, but he would ultimately die during the plague, the Great Plague, in 1347. And so, even though he was excommunicated, and even though nominalism generally is disdained within Catholicism because Thomism would become the dominant form of scholasticism, and nominalism ended up being associated after the Reformation with Luther. Nominalism itself was never condemned. I think his excommunication is seen as rather a political thing and probably doesn't hold as much weight as, say, an excommunication for heresy. Next up, we have the Apostles of Infinite Love has female priests. And I've made the Apostles of Infinite Love video Apostles of Infinite Love, a conclavist, if you want to call it that, Sedevacantist group, radical traditional Catholics who predate Vatican II. Interestingly, just as the old Catholics broke off from the Catholic Church and got a vernacular Mass, the Apostles of Infinite Love broke off from the Catholic Church and got a vernacular Mass as well. And just as the old Catholics broke off from the Catholic Church and got women ordination, the Apostles of Infinite Love broke off the Catholic Church and got women's ordination. And, women's ordination is kind of seen as this universal throughout all of Christianity, stepping outside of a Catholic lens, just stepping from a sociological or comparative religion lens. Female priests are kind of seen as this universal line. Once you cross that line, you're far more liberal, you're into liberal Christianity, and the weight of tradition and the weight of scripture really kind of declines. And it's interesting that this first traditionalist group now has female priests. The Society of St. Pius X, Asia is filled with the worst and craziest priests. This is just something I heard online, and this really has to do with the whole resistance movement, because a lot of these early resistance priests, they were in the Society of St. Pius X, Asia, and so, from my understanding, a lot of people will say that the more stable Society of St. Pius X priests, and it's hard because at the same time, I've heard that there was extreme selection, more than any normal diocese right now, in trying to pick out Society of St. Pius X priests, and they had a huge attrition rate, which is interesting, because it's just interesting in a lot of ways, because there's these people that are saying that the Society of St. Pius X, these Sedevacantists, they're trying to say they're picking out all these yes men priests because the Society of St. Pius X zigzags and so on. But they're also saying that the Society of St. Pius X has all these crazy priests, and these crazy and worse priests are sent off to Asia. I guess maybe it's true because the Asian ones seem to be pretty extreme. Most of them aren't East Asian or South Asian themselves. They're missionaries. Missionaries, of course, seem to be more aggressive oftentimes or more into private revelation compared to moral diocesan priests, so maybe that kind of mirrors that too. Bishop Williamson reordaining numerous priests behind closed doors. Now, I already kind of touched about this with Archbishop Vigano's reconsecration. I've just heard a lot of rumors throughout the traditional Catholic community that Bishop Williamson will just ordain a lot of priests that have questions about the validity of their ordination, and that there's a lot of priests that apparently he's reordained or conditionally reordained, and that this occurs behind closed doors. That does play into the controversies about the 1968 rite of ordination and rite of consecration, which numerous times have been talked about on this iceberg. But for the most part, the Society of St. Pius X believes in the ordination and consecrations are valid, but apparently they believe that some liberal bishops, that maybe those priests ordained by those liberal bishops should be reordained if they choose to do so. Next up, we have the Society of St. Pius V non-controversies. This kind of has to do with Father Shikata and Bishop Daniel Dolan saying that the Daughters of Mary, the Mother of Our Savior, is a cult, and that Bishop Kelly was a cult leader, that he kind of like entraps and brainwashes these women, that there were apparently deprogrammings of some of these nuns. So it's unclear how much of this is real and how much of this is infighting between the former members of the Society of St. Pius V after they left to their former patron and leader, Bishop Kelly. the Catholic Patriotic Association is trad. So the Catholic Patriotic Association is the official Catholic Church run by the Chinese government, and I've heard all this stuff about it is more trad than the underground Catholic Church in China, which is connected directly to the Vatican and not run by the Chinese Catholic government or the Chinese government. And so the idea is that the Catholic Patriarch Association is going under the rules or the way that Catholicism was practiced prior to when it was created, so prior to Vatican II, while the teachings and just kind of general culture of Vatican II has went through the faithful Catholics in China that are in the underground churches, of course, as a lot of people that talk about Chinese Catholicism know. People go back and forth between the Patriarch Association Church, the underground or catacomb church, the official legal church in Macau and Hong Kong, which is above ground, and that it's not so hard to point fingers at who is who sometimes. There's true believers in the Catholic Patriotic Association and so on. But the Catholic Patriotic Association seems to be higher church than the Catacomb Church. Next up, we have Vatican II exposes counterfeit Catholicism. This is a book written by the CMRI brothers, the Radicki brothers. This is a large treatise, about 800 pages. And so from my understanding, even if it hasn't talked about this much, I believe that this is the largest treatise on Sedevacantism ever written. I don't know anybody who's read it. It doesn't come up that much in traditional Catholic circles, apparently. Interesting. I hope one day I can read it. It seems very interesting that you have this very large treatise, and that there's all these treatises on Sedevacantism, but they're not brought up that much by Sedevacantists. Bishop George Musey. Bishop George Musey was a Sedevacantist bishop. He was, I believe, the first American to have Took orders, or orders descending from Archbishop Took. He was consecrated by Bishop Mose Carmona, and Carmona was assisted by Bishop Alfredo Zamora. Zamora and Carmona were consecrated bishops, of course, by Took themselves. Apparently, Bishop Musey was found as a traditional Catholic priest in Texas. He's from Galveston. That basically what was going on was that these Took bishops in Mexico, because of kind of the lawlessness of Mexico and everything that goes on there with the kidnappings and the cartels and everything, they were in danger because they were going from town to town and offering the Latin Mass, and they would get kidnapped by cartels and held ransom because they would go into dangerous territories. It's difficult to travel in certain areas of Mexico, and so they ended up being kidnapped by the cartels. Some people say that the Novus Ordo priests or bishops apparently paid the cartel to do so. I don't know how I don't know how valid that is, but what was going on lawless in Mexico, they're concerned that these Bishop Took orders would be lost, the possibility that episcopal consecrations would be lost, led to Carmona and Zamora consecrating Bishop Musey a bishop. Both of them died tragically, and Bishop George Musey ends up becoming the main, I guess you could say, line of succession for a period in the 90s of Took bishops. He also consecrates Louis Vier, or Vissier. I'm a mispronouncer, as you know. And basically, from my understanding, they split the church up on two sides of the United States, like down the middle. as far as the Mississippi River, and said, this is your diocese, even though neither of them are popes and can create dioceses. Anyway, eventually George Musey would get involved in ordaining priests for the CMRI after the whole Bishop Schuckardt scandals and the revelation that his holy orders came from the old Catholic Church. So he would reconsecrate and reordain, we'll get to the consecration. He would reordain the priests, and every year he would ordain a few priests for the CMRI. But eventually, Mark Privianus, he would be consecrated directly by Bishop Carmona before he would die, and that's where the CMRI's orders come from today. But Mark Privianus, his original priestly orders come from George Musey. George Musey, controversial character. I believe that he left the Novus Ordo priesthood and ran a restaurant as a normal guy for a while, and eventually became a Sedevacantist bishop. Next up, we have pre-Vatican II Sedevacantism. This is what I talked about with I keep saying bishop, he's not a bishop, William of Ockham, how he was a Sedevacantist. And if you look back throughout the history of anti-popes, Sedevacantism is a idea, and the value of the papacy goes back into pre-Nicene times. Saint Hippocleitus, of course, was an anti-pope in the 3rd century as opposed to Urban I, and he held Urban I to be an invalid pope because he wasn't rigorous enough, and Hippocleitus was elected by the rigorous schismatic party to be an anti-pope under the idea that Urban I was a heretic. Of course, Hippocleitus would reconcile and be martyred with the true pope, and he's a saint today. So it's interesting if you look at Hippocleitus as anti-pope, because there's so much that's going on there. It's so early, and the idea of this conflict over the papacy so early on in the church, it is very important in establishing papal primacy from Catholic apologetics and just in general in our theological theories concerning the legitimacy and power of the papacy. But it just shows that Sedevacantism has deep roots within Catholicism as an option or a viable course that heretics or schismatic people or people just in opposition to the Pope have thought about or even went down the route of before. I think I'm just catching this now. I think I skipped some up in the earlier one, so I think I skipped new ordinations are valid, new consecrations invalid. So I know that some of the priests of the Society of St. Pius V, most importantly Father Jenkins, will say that the new ordinations, they seem more valid than the consecrations, the changes in 1968. And so there's this idea that maybe the new priests were valid, but they're going extinct anyway because the new consecrations are invalid. And the other thing I skipped was Bishop Pfeffler. Bishop Pfeffler is a pretty important figure in the resistance movement. And now we get to where I left off. Bishop Pfeffler, Resistance Society of St. Pius X priest, pretty big loudmouth priest. I hope loudmouth, I guess that's kind of offensive, but very vocal man, and doesn't hold back his words in criticism of other figures in the resistance movement, kind of becomes a pariah. Anyway, he starts his own seminary. The seminary doesn't go anywhere because they don't have a bishop, because he's a pariah. And so he needs to be consecrated a bishop. So, because he's a pariah, Bishop Williamson is not going to consecrate him a new bishop. And so he ends up taking the holy orders of an obscure Feeneyite bishop whose orders descend apparently from the Palmarian de Troyes cult. And he becomes a Took bishop after he is consecrated a bishop by Bishop Noel Webster, whose orders descend, of course, from Took, but actually from Took through the Palmarian bishops. And this was videotaped and I think live streamed. And because Bishop Neil Webster, he's old, he's struggling. I think he suffered a stroke. He has a very difficult time with the Latin, very difficult time speaking in general. And so during this video of the consecration, a lot of people would say that it's unintelligible what he's saying during part of the consecration of Bishop Pfeiffer. And so Novus Ordo Watch and a lot of Sedevacantists, they're going to jump on this and say that he was invalidly ordained. Next up we have Western Rite Orthodox or Western Rite Orthodoxy. This is a very strange thing. This is divine liturgies or masses that are conducted in Eastern Orthodox churches, which are done to resemble the liturgy used in traditional Catholicism and High Anglicanism. It's interesting because it's created by Western converts and is a very long and convoluted history, and it goes back into the 19th century. And it is created by Western converts to try and recreate their idea of like what the Western Rite should be, and it's very controversial within Eastern Orthodoxy because the many Eastern Orthodox are very against unleavened bread use in the liturgy. So it's just this very bizarre thing, and now because it's been around for so long and it's kind of this weird created thing, and there's this idea in more radical Eastern Orthodox Western convert spheres of, the West was Orthodox and Catholicism is a created thing, and it wasn't, instead of what historically happened of this drift between Eastern and Western Christianity over time, and their ideas and theology drifted, and it's just this natural drift, which is completely what is going on in history. There's this radical Western convert thing in Orthodoxy to say that Catholicism was created top-down, and something like England was Orthodox until 1066 with the invasion of the Normans and they instituted Catholicism, and so on. Or Celtic Christianity was Orthodoxy against Roman Christianity, and so on. Or Leif Erikson was Orthodox, and so the Orthodox discovered America, not Catholic Columbus, right? These fairly radical Eastern Orthodox Western converse Eastern Orthodox fringes, I should say. And so in that you get Western Orthodoxy coming out of this fringe of Western Orthodoxy or Western converse Eastern Orthodoxy, and from that we have the Western Rite Orthodox. Very, very small. Most Western converts, of course, are going to go to Eastern divine liturgies. And so this Western Rite Orthodox thing is kind of now being used as a way to try and convert traditional Catholics and High Anglicans to Orthodoxy. Even though that if they do so, the vast majority of Orthodox have nothing to do with the Western Rite and view it as a very bizarre, astroturfed and created thing, and are going to look down on it. Anyway, Metapedia was Sedevacantist. Metapedia was it is still up. Metapedia is a far-right kind of mirror website of Wikipedia. It's supposed to be the far right-wing version of Wikipedia. It's very small. It doesn't have that many articles, and the articles are very tiny. But I remember screwing around and looking at Metapedia, and Metapedia was Sedevacantist. I don't think it's not Sedevacantist anymore, but historically there was some kind of Sedevacantist that became an editor on Metapedia, and he was editing the Catholic Church pages on Metapedia to be Sedevacantist, and there was actually pretty good history of Sedevacantism and the different clerics, different bishops, and their different groups on Metapedia for a while. It was pretty reliable and helpful. The Johannine Comma proves that the Vulgate is more reliable. The Johannine Comma is in the first epistle of John, phrases 5, 7 through 8, right? And so we're going to read from King James here. For there be three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. And there are three that bear witness on earth, the Spirit, the water, and the blood, and these three agree in one. So in the Greek, in heaven, the Father, the Word, the Holy Ghost, these three are one. That's not there. That's only in the Vulgate and certain Greek texts which are really late in the medieval era. It ended up being included in the King James Version because of the controversies regarding the verse during the Reformation and during Erasmus's creation of the Textus Receptus. Erasmus ultimately, after some controversy, included the Johannine comma. Catholics who support the Johannine comma literally use it kind of backwards because more pro-textual critics will use the Johannine comma as the most obvious example of an interpolation being regarded as scripture. And so in reverse, Catholics, traditional Catholics I should say, will point the Johannine comma as proving that the Vulgate is more reliable than Greek texts. Next up, Gregory the 17th is a cursed name. Gregory the 17th was used by two anti-popes, the founder of the Palmarian cult and the second pope of the Apostles of Infinite Love cult. And so, because there was both two anti-popes which started their own religions at the same time and who were in contention with each other as conclavist anti-popes that had Gregory the 17th as their pontifical name, that's really fascinating, and it seems that Gregory the 17th is a cursed name. Also, I've heard that the whole Cardinal Siri thing, that Cardinal Siri's purported papal name is also supposed to be Gregory the 17th. So Gregory the 17th comes across as a uniquely cursed papal name. Society of St. Pius X resistance priest raised somebody from the dead. So there was this story going on in CAF Info about a group of Society of St. Pius X resistance priests who visited a dead man to offer him the last rites. And apparently the man was resurrected, and then they offered him the last rites in person because he was dead when they approached him, and then apparently they must have resurrected him and did a miracle, and then gave him the last rites, and he died again. So this story was circling on CAF Info. The Solar Temple were took bishops. So the Solar Temple were a odd cult in Europe that committed suicide. In 1997 in France, the Order of the Solar Temple, or the Solar Temple, claimed to be a continuation of the Knights of Templar, which were, of course, banned. A crusading society, which was, of course, banned. In the Middle Ages, they were influenced by Rosicrucianism, Theosophy, and New Ageism in general. And like many practitioners of magic, they took old Catholic orders. And in this case, they took old Catholic orders. Boniface X, or should I say anti-Pope Boniface X. Boniface X runs RomanCatholicism.org, and he claims to be the Pope, but it's unclear how he has the claim of being the Pope. He is against conclavism in his apologetics. I can't find anybody saying how he claims to have become the Pope, so he seems to be a self-declared anti-Pope, which is fascinating. He has issued his own papal bulls. He's condemned Sedevacantist. He is Feeneyite. Some people are saying that he's Jansenist. And interestingly, he supports the Curse of Ham. And he has made it in his cult, if anybody follows him, Catholic dogma, the curse of Ham. The idea that black people are cursed to servitude and slavery because of they descend from Ham, and the curse that Noah placed upon Ham. Next up, we have Sinead O'Connor, was a Took bishop, or at least a Took priestess. She was a very troubled woman. She was a famous Irish singer, married, I believe, 4 times, very eccentric, very troubled, seemed to have pretty severe mental health issues because she was Ireland and she was rebellious against Irish culture. She became very anti-Catholic. This went through 2 phases. The first phase is that she became a female priest and her orders came through Bishop Took. The second phase was she converted to Islam shortly before she died. Next up, we have Christmas and Easter. Catholics are trad. Apparently, in earlier times when it was difficult to travel, you only had to go to church twice a year, I've heard. And so the idea is that Christmas and Easter Catholics are trad because they were following earlier rules of the Catholic Church when it was difficult to travel, and you could honor Sunday by not attending Mass, or the majority of people honored Sunday while not attending Mass and privately prayed during that day. And so those people that went to church during Christmastide and during Easter time, those are true trads, and that is the real traditional Catholic movement. Anyway, I just want to say I really appreciate everybody watching these videos. Even during the middle of making this one, things are coming up in my head that I forgot. And so it's just an endless deep dive, endless iceberg into the darkest abysses of things that are forgotten and unknown aspects of the traditional Catholic movement. I don't make these videos in any way to be anti-traditional Catholic. I just make them to try and share information about the movement and its history, which I find personally fascinating. And I think this whole iceberg thing, even if it's kind of overdone in the way that it explains things, I think it's pretty helpful and it's pretty accessible. So I hope that you guys enjoyed this and have a great day.